and welcome to the first of EmberWrite's Expert Craft Chats. In these sessions, we will be sitting down with authors, editors, and other industry experts to dive deep into both the craft and business of fiction writing. I'm Micah McGuire, co-founder and community lead for EmberWrite, and today I am joined by Clark Rowenson, award-winning author, blogger, and writing coach. Clark, also known as the Magic Engineer on YouTube, studies magic building like most study oil painting, and his prime directive is to help storytellers chart a path where their stories go beyond reality. Well, Clark, I am super excited to have you here today, and as a sci-fi and fantasy writer and just sci-fi and fantasy nerd, I am super excited to chat about this topic with world building and reality plus.
I'm excited to be here, and I'm always excited to talk about this stuff. So I always tell people it's a mixed bag because you get me talking about this, but I can and have talked about this stuff for hours.
Alrighty, well, awesome. We will go ahead and dive in. So let's just start with a quick one, just to kind of frame out our discussion. Whenever we are talking about world building, and more specifically, your reality plus philosophy, what are we actually talking about?
Yeah, so reality plus to me is anywhere our stories go beyond reality. That's why that's in my bio, and that's why it's called reality plus. We have the reality, and then there's the plus portion, which is what makes our stories speculative fiction. And this includes your magic systems that you would expect from like Brandon Sanderson. It includes advanced tech that you see in sci-fi, monsters, alien creatures, weird fundamental forces, and astrological phenomenon. All of that kind of stuff is reality plus. It's where it is deviating from our reality into something new and novel. So really, at the end of the day, if you're writing, you aren't actually writing sci-fi, you're writing a type of reality plus. You aren't actually writing epic fantasy, you're writing a type of reality plus. You aren't writing cosmic horror, again, type of reality plus. So it's this big umbrella term that includes all of these things. And the reason for that is we can approach building them and implementing them the same. There's nuances and things to understand, but that's the high level understanding where it all starts. Is if you're making something up that does not exist in our world, like cannot exist and function in our world, that's reality plus. This is not as simple as like fictional countries or fictional factions and guilds. That's you taking a thing that does exist and just making a new version of it that doesn't, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And I think it kind of explains why a lot of sci-fi and fantasy writers all tend to run in very similar crowds. So definitely do see where that comes from and see where that kind of has that root. Now that we've kind of got our topic set, I think let's talk a little bit first about kind of balancing all of this, because obviously like certain forms like tabletop RPGs, you're doing a lot of world building, but in a story, so in a novel, short story, anything along those mediums, there's a lot more to balance. So how do you actually do that and balance out those components?
So I want to make sure I understand your question. You're asking how do you balance out the world building with the character and with the story structure and all of that?
Absolutely.
Okay, so a lot of this, I think, and this is something we had talked before about maybe talking about where to start with some of this stuff. So a lot of this stuff kind of bleeds together when I think about it and when I'm coaching people on it, because the biggest thing is understanding where you should start, honestly, because we have all of these options. The main things that come into play when you're trying to execute and balance all of these things, all of these spinning plates we have, is where you want to start, which ones are most important to you, and then as you develop a clearer picture of the story you want to tell, really making sure you understand what is needed for that story to make it land the way you want to land. Those are really the main things, is like knowing where to start and making sure you understand what your story needs. Everything else can kind of fall into place, but if you're really focusing on those two, I think that helps with a lot of different things about it, because there are so many things to handle, right? It's a lot.
Yeah. Okay, so I guess along with that then, is there a better time to start your world building as far as where it fits in with your writing process? Is this something that you need to kind of have this stuff fleshed out before you begin writing your story? Is this something that you want to be building out as you go? How does that really work for, essentially fleshing out your world in the most efficient way possible?
Yeah, so my favorite answer to most questions is it depends. And the answer to this question is it depends. And by the way, this is Seamus for anybody who was watching. He's why the door was open in the first place. But it comes down to where to start building, because different people, we have different things that we gravitate to in our stories. So it is probably going to be no surprise to you or anybody who has watched my stuff or read any of my stuff that I'm able to start with Reality Plus systems. I can build out concepts for tech or for magic or for creatures, and from there start exploring what kind of world would this fit in. What kind of world do I want it to fit in? What kind of characters exist in this world? What sort of organizations and things? What kind of plot and things could happen? I'm able to start with the system and grow everything out from there. Not everybody can do that. Other people need to start with characters and have a really clear character concept for their protagonist, maybe their antagonist, maybe the whole crew if they're doing something like a fellowship or a 5-man band or something like that. They might need to really know their characters and how their characters are going to change. But once they understand that, of saying, hey, I have somebody who's going from being really reserved to being a leader and confident, all of that, and here's their background, they're able to start going into the world building Reality Plus systems that support that, or it can start with the world building. And this varies from person to person and from story to story. Way back when I was working on trying to figure out how magic system stuff worked, like how I was doing it and help other people do it, I was trying to help a friend of mine, and it just wasn't working. None of the ideas were really sticking. She wasn't feeling it, but we spent some time working on her setting and eventually came up with the idea of a living desert that is invading the land. And her eyes lit up and she started being like, okay, so now there's going to be cool monsters in the desert. There's going to be people who are trying to go into the desert to recover artifacts from things that have been swallowed by it. And so she started running off with all of these ideas. So that's what she needed. Then I was able to say, well, it sounds like you want to do sand magic. And she said, oh, yes. So the best time to start the world building depends on when you are ready for the world building and when you need the world building.
Okay. All right. I think that makes perfect sense. And I think it goes right along with a lot of the discussions that we have about, plotters versus pantsers versus plants.
Yes.
Where do you on that spectrum? So I would probably say maybe this is you have your world builders first on one side, your character builders first on the other, and maybe in the middle you've got your folks that need their plot together first.
I call them access points into your stories. So if you think of it like a big underground dungeon or something like that, where there's different areas that you can enter, and the different areas have different hazards and challenges and stuff like that. We, based on what our preferences are for story and what our skills are better equipped to handle entering the dungeon from a specific entrance. Okay. So it's about understanding that so you know which one to go into, and then as you level up and progress and that kind of thing, you can then start exploring the other parts of the dungeon that will be your story.
I love that metaphor because it makes me think of, any RPG game where you have that choice between, are you going to have increased strength, defense, or magic?
Right.
And I think with that, how do you end up figuring out where your preference is? I'm sure, maybe it evolves somewhat just as you continue to do more and more stories. But if you're kind of in that territory where maybe you've only written one novel so far, maybe you've done short stories and you're setting out on your first couple of novels, how do you start to figure out which access point is going to be most accessible to you?
Yeah. So the question that I ask basically everybody that I end up coaching is, we have a handful of common elements across stories that exist in all stories, right? You have character, plot, setting, theme, genre elements and genre tropes. And then if we're doing speculative fiction, we have the Reality Plus portion. If you have those 5 things and you were reading a story or watching a movie or whatever, and you were giving a letter grade to each 5 of these elements of the story, let's say 4 of the 5 are a solid C-. None of them are in F territory, because the second any of them drop into F territory, the whole thing is in trouble, right? If things have to be at a certain level of quality. But for you, which of the 5 things, if it was an A+, you would forgive all the C-? Okay. So that's where I generally have people start. Okay. It's like, what are the top 1 or 2 things that if they ace that, you'll forgive a bunch of subpar things as long as they're not failing, right? The second any of these things flat out fail, we have a problem.
Yeah. That is so funny because that makes a lot of sense to me because I think, I've always ended up starting with either a plot idea or a character idea. And I tend to not do a whole lot of character driven writing, but I tend to need an idea of my characters from the start while I'm developing that plot. So I tend to start off in that area and then I go more into the world building and, oh, okay, well, what if we use this or what if we use that? But that is funny because I would say probably characters and plot would be the two that I would need an A plus, and I might forgive, B minus world building and like maybe a
Right.
C
Right.
minus with the setting or something like that. So that's
Right.
incredibly interesting. So that's a really great question to kind of understand which of those access points are going to be the easiest for you.
And then the second part of that is asking which is your favorite to write. Like if you've done stories before, it's hard when you haven't done it before. If you haven't done it before, I say like analyze what is most important to you into stories that you consume. Then try and start with that. But then as you're going through, pay attention which of the ones sparks the most ideas, right? Which is the one that really gets your brain going, which is the one that you have the most fun working on and flows the most smoothly.
Yep.
That's where you start. They aren't always the same, but they're often the same, right?
Okay.
So that's where if it's like, okay, if you can't pick one, maybe pick your top one or two.
Okay.
And then that's a place to try and start. But you might find that based on the story or based on you, it's different, because really what we're trying to do is we're trying to find where that Venn diagram overlaps between the things that you really care about and the things that you are good in making. That's really what you're trying to find.
And that's, I guess it would be kind of like your writer's ikigai, I guess would be maybe the term to a
Yeah.
certain extent.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. It's your theme. It's what you're kind of kitted out for. Going back to the dungeon analogy, right? It's like looking at it and being like, oh, I guess I have high poison resistance. I should probably start in the part of the dungeon that has poison rather than the part of the dungeon that has fire.
that makes perfect sense. And I think with that, my big question is how does this differ for each of the access points? Is there a point where they kind of all converge and you all get to the center of the dungeon, for lack of a better term? Or is it you kind of all have this unique path to begin building your story and you're going to kind of feel it out? And yes, you may converge at a couple of points, but they're generally all going to stick to their arenas of the dungeon.
It varies, and the metaphor isn't perfect, but the way I think of it is your story is the dungeon, and you are trying to uncover and map all of it so you can then describe and deliver it to somebody else. Is
Okay.
really kind of what you're trying to map the dungeon and all of its quirks and things so somebody else can go and enjoy it.
Okay.
So you go through one of the main entrances, and then once you're in, you deal with that area, and as you are messing around in your primary area, you'll find doors to other area to the different sections of the dungeon, and you'll be able to start venturing in. You may need to come back and learn some more. So it's kind of becomes like your home base.
Mm-hmm.
So like for you need plot and character. I don't know whether you need character or plot first. It might change depending on the book. So what that would look like is you spend some time really developing as clear a concept of you can for the characters. Don't go overboard, because the amount that you need the amount of detail you need varies as you're going through your exploration. Which, you don't need to defeat the boss of the poison area before you get enough skills to go into the fire
Right.
zone. So you develop what you need so that you feel comfortable starting to explore in the plot. And if the plot isn't driving and something doesn't make sense, you're like, I don't know what's going to happen here. I don't know what's going to motivate them. Then you go back to character and you work on character some more. So
Gotcha.
it's just something where you keep probing and branching out until you are able to eventually explore and clear the entire dungeon.
Okay, so it's kind of like being almost underleveled or overleveled in different arenas. So you might
Yeah.
have a case where you can go clear out the boss of your character section really, really easily, but you
Right.
wander over into plot and immediately realize that you are outranked.
Exactly. At
Okay.
which point you have to go back to the character area, rekit, redevelop some skills, or maybe you're like, I'm not ready for that yet. It looks like it's time for me to go into the setting portion of this and do some dungeon diving in that portion. And then maybe there I got what I need. Like, I now know how to solve this problem over in the plot section. So
Right.
like That's why I like the metaphor of it. It makes sense to the gamer in me.
Along with that, like if we were going to describe the different arenas, so I know obviously, plot would be one, character would be one. We've mentioned setting. I'm sure, the reality plus part of the dungeon would be another one. Are there other elements that basically we need to also be thinking about here?
I mean, it's the five big ones that you hear over and over anytime that you're reading a book on writing of character, plot, setting, theme, and then genre specific elements and tropes, right? There's certain expectations that come with different genres you're writing in, whether it's historical fiction that doesn't have reality plus in it, or you are doing speculative fiction that does have reality plus in it. If it has reality plus, then reality plus becomes an extra thing that you have to play with.
Okay.
And you can subdivide those and add classifications as much as makes sense for you, as long as it's helpful to you, right? If it's helpful for you to break character down into protagonists and antagonists and side characters, you do that. If it's helpful for you to break it down into like skills, backstories, and character arc, then you do that.
Okay.
When I do my coaching, I'm very much about like, let's find the path of least resistance for you with this story. So it's really just understanding what your overall goal is and being willing to change tactics and go different ways as you build up your skills and your toolkit, basically.
Yep. Okay, great. And I do want to kind of briefly jump back into the dungeon metaphor just for a moment, because I think, again, fellow RPG gamer here, I think a lot of us, whenever we're playing video games, have a tendency to go down every single nook and cranny trying to find all of the treasure chests and basically complete the entire map. But obviously, when it comes to writing a story, that can lead you to having something that is a lot of tangents and a lot of essentially, you end up with a story that's essentially world building vibes, for lack of a better term, with maybe the super light on the plot or super light on the character. So how do you I guess the first question would be is how do you contain that when you're starting a new story and kind of like resist that urge to go down every corner of the map and include that in your story? And then I guess the second one attached to that, which we'll get to in just a minute, is more of if you have a story that you filled out the entire map in the world building portion of dungeon and then have not done a lot with character and plot, how do you start untangling that?
Yeah, so the answer for both of those is actually fairly similar. The answer is basically the same, which really comes down to managing how detailed your information is.
Okay.
Managing and paying attention and managing the needs and relevance.
Okay.
So relevance is a big one. Like that's something that we talk about in my writing group and when I'm coaching with people. That's relevance is how you handle info dumping and a lot of things like that, right? So an info dump is when you get a whole bunch of information just to give them information. And the way you make it so it's not info dumping is you make it so all the information you give them, give the audience or give the characters, is immediately relevant to what is happening right now. And you can sneak small things in there, which will then be plot threads and foreshadowing for stuff later. But you can't do a whole bunch of paragraphs that are just foreshadowing. You have to sneak the foreshadowing in with other things that are relevant. So that's a big part of it, is if you're getting into a bunch of detail about things, right? You started doing the world building and you've decided, hey, I want to do a kind of magic system that centers around magical currency, right? So cool, that makes sense. There's some fun stuff you could do. You start going into dealing with economics, you start building out the banks, and then you start building out exchange rates, and then you start defining the different savings plans that are in the banks and the way that they protect everything. You're at that point is where you need to stop and ask, like, how much of what I'm doing here is relevant to my overall story idea? Because it might be and it might not be. I'm always hesitant to give like blanket advice because so much like it depends on the individual. But what I do and has worked well for a lot of people is don't answer questions until you have to. Record ideas, but don't answer specific questions until you have to. So if we go back to the money magic, for lack of a better word, you have money magic. It's an obvious leap that there's going to be some kind of banking or secure system for handling and keeping these things secure. You know that. You know there's going to be secure vaults. You know there's some kind of exchange rate. There's people who work for the bank. We know all of these things exist. You don't need to actually develop any of the details until the details are relevant.
So basically, if we were going to, let's take two different potential plots here. Let's say that the money magic, maybe in the first plot, you have a freelance magician. So probably in those cases, it would be less focused on his time in the bank and basically the security. He might pop in and basically have a couple of interactions there, but probably
Yeah,
not focus on that. However, if we were going to follow, let's say, a group of thieves, let's say it's the Ocean's 11 of this magic world,
exactly.
all of a sudden, all of those systems start to matter a lot more because they're going to be focused on, okay, well, we have to disable the security here. We have to get into
Right.
this vault with this lock. So
Exactly.
that's kind of the way that it should work, is that you're thinking about this of what's going to matter the most for the plot and the characters that you have in mind.
Right. Now, that is an excellent example, because if we take that a little bit further, say we have this freelancer who's really struggling financially, and you're doing kind of a noir style thing, right? So he's borderline broke and owes people a lot of money. So there, now it makes sense for you to explore the loan structure and how that works magically and how that works economically and socially, right? What kind of people are they going to send after? How did he get his loans? Did he get his loans through some sketchy means, right?
Mhm.
Now all of that stuff is important. We don't need to know about the security of the vaults unless he decides he's going to rob the bank. But on the other hand, we're dealing with the thieves. They don't need to know about the loan structure. They don't need to know about the payment recovery structure or anything like that. They just need to know about the security.
Okay. But I think, this is kind of attaches to another question that I thought of while we were discussing this, is I think especially writers tend to have these details that we have in our heads, and they're kind of in the background of our heads versus what actually gets on the page. And I think for a lot of us, the struggle typically is we meant to put details that are in our heads that are on the page that don't necessarily make it there. And usually we get that in critiques or beta reading or things like that
Yes.
of, I didn't understand this detail or I didn't understand that detail. What happens when we kind of have to do the opposite? Like, how do we balance, like, I need to strip this down on the page a little bit, even though I have all of this in the back of my head? So let's say, you're writing the freelancer magician and you have the security system and all of that in the back of your head. How do you kind of manage having that not spill onto the page as much?
Yeah. So I'm going to back up to something a little bit. It really is important. I find it very useful having the list of the high level ideas
Okay.
of like writing through, like if I'm doing a money magic system, here's all of the things that are likely to exist in the world. Here's the things that people are probably going to do, things that people are going to deal with, and things that people are going to have ways to address it, right? And just having that list of ideas is now kind of fodder whenever you need it. So you can then go grab these different threads and these different components like as you need. So you might be going through the world and you come up with your freelancer interacts with another character. Like, what would make them interesting? I like this character, I have him in my head, I need him to be relevant to the plot. Well, you know that there's banks, you know that there's collection agencies. So maybe this is somebody who used to work for the bank and is now working for a collection agency. So bam, you're now pulling in these things that you didn't necessarily have, but it's making this character more interesting and tying things together. So that's something that's really nice. And then you can dig into the details. So I'm a really big advocate for having the general ideas and then building the specifics once you realize you need it. If you've gone the other way and you've already gone a whole hog, so to speak, on having all of this stuff built out, the two things you need to know. One, this is a piece of GMing advice that I got, sort of game mastering for tabletop RPGs. Planning doesn't go bad. Fair. And ideas don't go bad.
Yep.
So just because it doesn't make it into your book does not mean it's wasted. It can feel like that was wasted time and effort. Believe me, I'm really fixated. I like productivity and time management, that kind of thing. So I really run into that where I'm like, oh, we spent all this time on this thing and I didn't use it. That sunk cost fallacy, and it's not actually wasted because I might use it later.
Yep.
Or I might use what I developed here. I might reskin it in a different version for something else. So one, it's not wasted. Two is the relevance. It's really all about the relevance of asking yourself, is this something these characters would be thinking about, learning about, or talking about right now? And is this something that anybody present or the audience needs to know right now?
Okay.
If the answer is no for both of it, you can just rip it out.
Okay.
It's still there. Yeah, you know how it works. So you just knowing how it works is going to affect how you write the rest of it, because you'll hold to your internal logic.
Right.
But you don't need to communicate all of that to the reader and to the characters.
And like, guys, this is the reason why in EmberWrite we have certain things like the trash folder, snapshots, things like that, is so that doesn't feel like wasted work, essentially. And, a lot of this is why we have the research space. So basically, if you have stuff that lived in world building that you're saying, I don't know that it still fits, move it over to a separate section to where it's just things that you can come back to time and time again, because you might have another novel. Let's say you decide to do the freelance magician for your first one, but then your next one you do want to do the Ocean's 11. All of a sudden, all of that stuff that may not have been relevant to the freelancer might become relevant to your Ocean's 11 crew.
Yep.
So I love that, because I think, again, I think we tend to be very hard on ourselves as writers about, oh, this was wasted time, or this was wasted effort, or wasted words. And it's very funny to me that it's probably one of the few crafts that does that, because we have, with the visual arts, practice sketches, warm-up sketches, all kinds of different things that no one looks at an artist and says, oh, that was wasted time or wasted effort. That's practice for them. And I think with writers, we're so fixated on getting the story together and getting something cohesive built out that we tend to put a lot of pressure on ourselves in that context. So I love that, basically, treating it as it's never wasted effort.
Yeah. And I have to repeat that to myself a lot, because I do struggle with that. There's one other thing that I want to mention around this, around cutting out information. That's paying attention to the feedback you get. This is something I ran into with my writers group when I first joined, is they would have something in there that I didn't understand. I'd mention, I'm like, I don't understand how this works, or why they're doing this, or any of this kind of thing. It seems like information is missing. And then they would proceed to give me all of the information. And it took a couple of times, but I had to say, like, that's great. Now I know, but nobody else reading this is going to know. So you need to take what you told me and find a way to put it in here, or in the chapters around here, because that's the context I was missing. But just because you know it doesn't mean your audience is going to know it. You have to communicate it.
Yep.
So it's the other side of, you can't just rip everything out wholesale, because if it's relevant, you need to find a way to keep it in there so they have what they need.
And I can imagine, as with any edits or rewrites, you have to make sure that you don't have ripple effects down the road, because if you rip out one piece of world building and that was, critical to the climax of your story, now all of a sudden you're left with a hole that you have to go in and fill at that point.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think I want to shift a little bit more into talking about your Reality Plus system and things like that, because I know you've kind of discussed that there's different categories under Reality Plus, and I don't want to get too deep into categories as much as this at a higher level. If I am good at one category, does it have kind of cross-pollination between the categories, or is it a case where, I may be really good at building magic systems, but when it comes to writing like a creature, I'm terrible and I have to go through and relearn all of this, essentially?
I don't think so. I came up with a metaphor for this, and then I was angry that I didn't think of this metaphor sooner. So what you're referring to are what I call the spheres of Reality Plus. And a better way to think of them is, these are our primary colors that we're using when we're painting a Reality Plus picture. With the primary colors, right, we have red, yellow, and blue, and then you have the black and white saturation.
Right.
And with Reality Plus, we have magic, tech, creatures, and fundamental forces. So they are things that stand on their own. Just like you can paint with pure blue, you could tell your story with just tech, but they're primary colors that can be mixed and blended into an endless array of new colors and pictures and paintings. In terms of being familiar with one, it's not that you aren't going to be able to do the others. It's more that you are very familiar with the requirements of a specific sphere. It's just experience of learning how to work with these other colors and how to blend with those other colors. You aren't innately going to not be able to do magic systems. There is one place where how we think and how we approach stories does matter to building our stories. And I just have to ask, I think I just saw, is that Clariel on your bookshelf back there?
I am a massive fan of the Old Kingdom series. Have loved it since I was a kid. So
same. Same. Not many people know Garth Nix. People watching, read Garth Nix.
Yeah.
He's great.
If you want to start with Lyriel like I did and then treat Sabriel as prologue, you can do that, but Sabriel is actually the first book of the series. So.
Yes. Okay, so I distracted myself. But where your mentality does matter is in my magic system blueprint. I talk about the types of magic, where a lot of people are becoming more and more familiar with the concept of hard and soft magic.
Right.
And I take that and break it down a little bit further. So it's not just hard and soft. It's hard and soft and rational and irrational.
That is an incredibly interesting axis to me, because all of a sudden I'm already thinking of how that might apply. Let's talk a little bit more about the rational versus irrational.
Yeah, so the short version is I have my arm pinned by a dog, so it's going to be hard to show you. But it's a little graph, right? So you have hard and soft in the vertical axis, rational, irrational, and soft and the x-axis. So you end up with 4 quadrants of hard rational, hard irrational, soft irrational, and soft rational. If you're familiar with the kind of Sanderson definition of hard soft, that runs diagonal. So when most people say hard magic system, they're talking about a hard rational system. And when most people say soft, they're talking about a soft irrational system. Bringing all of this up because the way you think can be very important for where you want to fall on the rational, irrational spectrum, as well as the hard and soft spectrum. If you are an engineer and you do a lot of coding and you do a lot of if this then that statements, you do a lot of gaming that has a bunch of sequencing. If you do that kind of pattern analysis, that kind of cascading effect, if you like doing dominoes, like metaphorical dominoes, mathematical dominoes, like if you like doing that kind of pattern and chain of event kind of thing, you will have an easier time doing rational systems, because that's what rational systems are. They're all about that if this then that, and predict, and the ability to take what we've been given to predict things we haven't seen yet. Mm-hmm. Irrational is the other side, where what we have seen doesn't prepare us for the things that are coming.
Okay.
And what we learn about one thing can't necessarily be applied to other things. It might be, but not necessarily. So what we learn about the One Ring in Lord of the Rings does not teach us anything about Gandalf's powers.
Gotcha.
What we learn about Thor in the Marvel Cinematic Universe doesn't tell us anything about Tony Stark or Spider-Man or anything like that. So if you kind of have the mentality where you like to have a bunch of different things, like you like to just have a bag of a bunch of different shiny rocks, then you might be better suited for doing a more irrational system. None of them are better than the others. They have different strengths and weaknesses and can do different things for your stories. And this is all the stuff that I get very, very excited and nerdy about. But that's where your personality and the way you think tends to matter the most. Is it if you aren't used to doing that really kind of procedural SOP physics kind of thinking or programming logic kind of thinking, then you have to learn to do that in order to do rational systems. So like it's a thing that can be hard to learn.
Yes. That makes total sense. And I think it sounds like we're going to also have to do a session on irrational versus rational magic systems as well.
There is a little bit for the hard and soft spectrum as well, but I find it most noticeable with the rational, irrational, where like the way you think affects what you're able to do easily and instinctively.
And I think kind of, do you have cases where maybe you have a mix of systems in the same novel? Because I'm thinking about the Old Kingdom series, and I'm thinking about the difference between free magic versus charter magic. And charter magic tends to be a lot more rule bound. It tends to be, we kind of know how casting works a little bit stronger. I would say both of them kind of lean a little bit softer, I would say. But with free magic, it's a very open and wild sort of magic. I don't know that any of us could say, okay, well, predictably, we know the difference between the kind of free magic creatures that are going to come up and things like that.
So you were asking whether we can have like the different types.
Yes. Could you have like a soft irrational and then a soft rational? I can imagine it might be harder to have like a soft irrational and then a hard rational, because that feels like the personality type of the writer might kind of come into play there. But you can have these different systems. And then there's another part of this where a lot of this comes down to perspective and how you want to define your system. So all of the stuff that I talk about and the way I think about these things is it's really just modes. They're frameworks and ways of thinking that you can apply to your stories and your systems. You then choose how you apply them and where you place things. So I might decide a system is hard rational, and you look at it and you're like, that seems more soft rational.
that's fine. That's your understanding of it. If that helps you understand it and work with it, that is perfect.
Yeah.
The reason I bring that up is because, yes, you might have multiple systems that are very different, or you might consider them all one system that just have these pieces that are very different from one another.
Okay.
And it all comes down how you want to define it. But yes, you can have those, and that's where understanding the strengths and weaknesses and the roles they're going to play is important. So, because we're talking about the Old Kingdom, we have free magic, we have charter magic, and then we have necromancy. Those are the main things that we see. And necromancy is honestly a specific part of free magic that has a little bit more structure imposed on it, but is not ordered as much as the charter magic, which, by the way, a charter is just a document or an agreement. And this is also me turning it into a pitch for the Old Kingdom series to get people interested, because charter magic, ancient magical beings formed a charter between themselves about how the world was going to work. So they bound free, wild, uncontained magic into rules and structures by forming a charter together.
Guys, if you've not read the series, it is fascinating. So, and I think Paul will back us up on this as well, because he's also a fan.
So charter magic is you using symbols and statements from the charter to create magical effects.
Yeah.
Free magic, like you said, wild, untamed, it can be anything, and what it can do is crazy, other than it tends to be very powerful, very overwhelming, and very chaotic.
And very hard for humans to use specifically, too. So.
Right. So then the way he uses those is fantastic, because free magic is a wonderful source of conflict and antagonism. Because it's wild, it's untamed, it's dangerous, it burns, it hurts. That makes it a great thing. You don't need a bunch of information. We just need to know that that is dangerous. You don't mess around with free magic creatures, because if you do, it's a bad idea. You're probably
there's going to be a bad time. I don't think there's ever been a point where the free magic has come up that it's actually ended up being positive overall.
Yeah. So I think you see the point, but yes, you can have these different types of systems as long as you understand the role they serve. And really the problems we run into with Reality Plus is when we try and force them into a role that doesn't fit.
Okay.
Because can you imagine if we took the free magic as in that as it is in the Old Kingdoms,
right,
and then tried to present that as a rational system like we see in Sanderson stuff?
Oh, that would be very hard.
And I'm not even talking about us making new rules and stuff, because we could turn it into a rational system. But if we just put it in there and the characters were using it in the same way, and it was supposed to be a key part of like these twists and these revelations and these final reveals, it wouldn't work, because there's not enough pattern recognition and there's not enough information around free magic as it is for us to do that without it being annoying.
Gotcha.
And vice versa, if we take something very well worked out like allomancy and then we just give it to the antagonist, we don't need to know the entire system. We only need to know the parts of the system that are relevant to defeating the antagonist.
Right.
If you then give us the entire magic system and show us all the kinds of things that they can do with it, that's a bunch of wasted information for the audience.
Yep. That is perfection. For the next question, I kind of want to take a step back from just magic systems and kind of look again at Reality Plus as a whole. And this one is a selfish question on my part. As far as limitations to the number of elements you should include, is there a limit there? Is there a point that there's just too much in the system? And the reason I ask specifically is because I have this sci-fi idea bouncing around in my head. It's going to probably be a mecha novel, and of course there's going to be these swarm-like creatures that are threatening technology that the mechas would end up fighting. But then I have this potential that I might include this kind of more supernatural force involved that I keep looking at, and every time I try to work that in, I go, oh, that just feels like that's going to be too much and it's going to be overwhelming to the story. So is there a point where there's just too many elements at once to where you're going, this is going to be too much for one story?
So I'm going to tackle this in two parts, because that is one of the most common, I hesitate to even call it a mistake, but one of the most common mistakes would be including too much in your system. And really what I mean by that is giving too many capabilities to your system. So being like, okay, we have this magic system, we have this tech, or this creature, we have this alien creature, and it can do X and it can do Y and it can do A through Z, and then it can do ZA through ZZ, right? Like it can do a huge number of things. It can be overwhelming, but really where that's more of the problem is when the sheer amount of capabilities makes the number of options paralyzing, hard to keep track of, or there's so many options that all conflicts become trivial.
That's fair. And I think the way that I'm almost kind of thinking about this is the limitations are almost like whenever we're talking about building characters, which I think, most writers have a good understanding of. You have to have, basically positive traits and negative traits. And those negative traits are going to be things that, if you're talking on terms of the protagonist, the things that trip that protagonist up. It sounds like we have to have limitations to these systems because we end up in the same problem we would with a character, that if you make them too good at too many things, or you make them to where they don't have these negative traits, it either makes them difficult to write or it makes them uninteresting. So it sounds like the limitations are really where the systems actually, you can kind of have fun with them, and
right,
what makes those systems interesting.
And there's a bunch we could talk about matching your story to your weak points of your system, or making a system with weak points that match your story. I was just talking about this with somebody this morning, about how taking a Superman type hero and then putting them in an action adventure story will lead to very different results from taking a Superman hero and putting them into a rom-com.
That's okay. That's a really funny way to think of it. But yeah, I can see how, if Superman's, super punches and everything else aren't suddenly going to help him out with the conflicts in a rom-com.
So it's about the alignment. That's a big thing there. And then there is a place for power fantasy and wish fulfillment. It is something that I didn't used to think, but especially with the rise of lit RPG, we're seeing that a lot in lit RPG. There's a whole bunch of people who want overpowered characters.
Yep.
Just if you're doing that, you need to be doing that deliberately for those people, and understand that you're going to be losing a bunch of people who don't want that.
So understanding your audience, ultimately.
Yes.
Understanding who's going to. Okay.
So that's where the problem can come in, is if the capabilities start leading to these other plot problems, right? Of they're too capable, they have too much, nothing's really a problem. But the complexity can be a problem, where it's like, no, I know that we can do this with the tech that we have. We just have to know how to build it, and none of us know how to build it. Like, then that works. Yep. Or, but really the issue you come into when you have something that is that expansive with that many different systems, you start running into the limits of the medium, which is basically just how much screen time you have, how many words you have. So if you were including all of that, if you're including the mechs, you said you wanted to do some kind of a swarm, like monster kaiju kind of thing, and some sort of more mystical force, that's 3 systems, potentially with a lot of rules and a lot of complications.
Right.
And you have 1 book, which means you have tops. If you're doing a long book like I did, you're working around like 150,000 words.
Right.
Which means you're limited into how deep you're going to be able to dive into all of those. And then it becomes a huge question of triage. Yeah. So can you do that? Yes. Will you be able to do a full exploration of all 3 in 1 book? Absolutely not. So then it becomes more important for you to be like, well, obviously since my main character is a mech pilot, I'm going to have to dedicate most of the time to the mech system.
Yep.
So just understanding that as you go in and being like, that's going to make this force extra soft, extra irrational, until maybe later in the series when I have screen time, the words to explore and make it into something else, it's going to have to stay in this quadrant until I have time to turn it into something else on page.
So basically it's a matter of trade-offs, and maybe the kaiju forces may feel a little bit more shallow if I want to go explore the supernatural force instead.
Right.
Okay. Awesome.
And there are tricks you can do if you want them all to be a certain type of system. There are tricks you can do to try and quickly communicate that without you going into full detail.
Right.
So maybe you do want the kaiju to be eventually be a hard rational system, but you want to make it clear that there is rationale to it, even if we aren't exploring it. There's ways you can do that quickly and effectively. And same thing with the mystical force. If you want to make it clear that it's irrational to everybody who's there, there's ways you can do that quickly and effectively without going fully into the details of the system.
Okay, Great. So I think we're getting a little bit into the process side here, and I am curious, do you have guides, outlines, anything that you use to kind of keep track of these systems? Because I know you mentioned like you like to have this list of the general questions. Do you have ways that you generate that initially? Is that something that is kind of like you have a template for that, or is that something that, you've gotten more from just exploring this with, different coaching clients or exploring it yourself?
All of it comes from exploring it with myself, thinking about it, testing it with people, that kind of thing. I have some stuff codified in places that people can follow. Some of it is just currently just exists in my brain or things that I work through. There is the Magic System Blueprint, which you can see back here, which is very useful for alignment and helping you understand what your Reality Plus system can be and how it can fit into your story.
Mhm.
I have a bunch of exercises and stuff I do with people when you're trying to do brainstorming. I don't have videos and books on all of these things yet. So that is where like coming and getting the coaching with me is then I can dive into whatever it is you need. In terms of the stuff that I have out, I have the Magic System Blueprint. I have a workbook specifically for building restrictions and limitations called Restrictions May Apply. I have my YouTube channel where there's a fair bit of content. I just yesterday wrapped up my first cohort of a 2-day workshop where we went through the 7 stages of building a Reality Plus system.
Mhm.
And there we went through all of the exercise, like we're going to do some brainstorming exercises. We're going to do some refinement, some definition, some alignment. So we went through all of that, and I'm looking to do more of those in the future and eventually turn those into books and video courses. I have a lot of things that I want to do.
Sounds like it. And I love that you also included the brainstorming, because I think that's something with EmberWrite that we've talked a lot about. We understand that there's the push that you can't just procrastinate and not write. Basically, you can't just build everything else out or have it all in your head. But to a certain extent, I think we have gotten to, as a industry, gotten so focused on, oh, you must be writing, that we kind of discount the thinking part of it and the, understanding and getting some of the wrinkles worked out mentally, honestly, on some of these things. So I love that basically you talk a lot about the brainstorming side of things. So we will wrap up with a couple of more questions. I think the first one that I'd love to know is if you could go back to your past self whenever you just started to write, what would be like one of the things that you would want to tell your past self about world building specifically?
You don't have to do all of it. World building is very cool, but is also very overwhelming to me.
Yep.
Which makes sense if you stop and think about it, because world building is literally all the knowledge we have about the universe and the world is everything that you could use for world building. That's all of the info. If you wanted to fully build a world, that's everything that you would need. And it is so much. And you don't have to do all of it. You will hear a lot of people saying like, oh, food is critical for culture. Clothing is critical for culture. Making sure you understand the arts is critical for culture. You have to have your culture in order to do like nations and factions. Those things are all true, but you don't actually need all of them.
Okay. And again, I think it goes back to your point about relevance, that ultimately, if the cultures and the food, let's say if you've got a chef character, naturally, of course, the food's going to be important. If you've got, characters that are having basically, negotiations between two very separate cultures, those cultural differences are going to be important. So again, I think, really hanging it on that hat of relevance really, really helps.
Relevance, what you already know and what you can easily learn.
Mhm.
Like that's where I encourage people to focus, because the whole thing of write what you know, that's part of it. If you're already a teacher, you may be tempted to do just a standard epic fantasy where you have blacksmith's apprentice who goes off and starts doing things. But consider what it would be like if you did a story that was about a professor
Right.
at a magic school. Like,
Yep.
you know what it is to be a teacher. You know how curriculum design and all of that stuff works. So go take all of that and tell a dark academia story from the professor's side, where you can download all the information you have instinctively and apply it laterally to the Reality Plus portion of dealing with mutants and magic and tech. Like, do that. I would have to learn a bunch if I wanted to develop like a realistic education system.
Right. Right.
If you're a teacher, you've got that information already. Lean into that.
Yeah. And I think that also goes for like past knowledge or the knowledge of the people around you that you're close to. I mean, basically, folks in your family, close friends, things like that. I mean, don't be afraid to talk to them about this stuff as well, because oftentimes maybe they've got perspectives that you wouldn't otherwise have. So, okay, that is a great one. Now, last question. Your top 3 stories, movies, novels, as far as world building. What are your top 3 that you would say were just absolutely just peak of world building for you?
There's so many good ones. I do really like the Old Kingdom series. Most of Sanderson's stuff has impeccable world building. I also really like Perdido Street Station by China Mieville.
Okay.
Perdido Street Station was, I think, his first book, and I absolutely adore it. I do not like his other books. Lots of other people do, but the world building that he does it's a crazy grab bag of so much stuff. And he manages it in such a way that it's just great. He even manages it in a way where there's portions where you are just getting straight up info dumping, but it's so interesting and so tied to like understanding a specific character and that kind of thing, or understanding the situation they're walking into, that it just works. Yeah, those are some of the best ones. There's so many good ones though. Like, don't just leave it at that. If we want to branch into video games, Mass Effect is crazy good. I'm working on a video where I'm talking about Star Wars, Mass Effect, and Shadowrun and how they manage the relationship between their magic and their tech. But Mass Effect is just so good. Such deep lore. Like, I cannot say enough good things about Mass Effect. They build out this whole bunch of history so that you are dropped in the middle of all of these conflicts, all of these relationships, and all of the stuff that is going on. And it's yeah.
Hey, always a good one. With all of that being said, last thing is, where can our listeners find out more about you, your writing, your world building philosophy, and your coaching?
Yeah, the best places to find me are YouTube and then joining my newsletter. I have not been as great about posting on my blogs on my website, but you can get information and stuff on my website. There's a bunch of old blog posts there. But YouTube, The Magic Engineer, and my website, crrowenson.com. You can join up for my newsletter, and Patreon. Those are the 3 main places that you'll get updates. Patreon gets extra articles every month, early access to any articles that are going to be released to the public, and access to ad-free versions of my videos. The newsletter is mostly monthly updates of here's what I've been up to, here's the status on my projects, that kind of thing.
Okay. Fantastic. And we will have those links in the description of this video for you, so you guys can visit them at any time. All right. Well, Clark, thank you so much for a fantastic session. It was a great one. Again, getting to nerd out about this stuff is just fantastic.
Yes. Thank you so much for having me. I would love to do more to dive into greater detail in any of the stuff that we talked about.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us, and we will see you at our next Craft Chat.